So, uh, good evening. I'm Victor Curran, and I welcome you on behalf of the Transcendentalism Council of First Parish in Concord, Massachusetts, for those of you who are joining us from out of state. Um, our group plans and presents events that educate and celebrate the people and events that made Concord a center of American independence and imagination. So 150 years ago, Thomas Wentworth Higginson was widely admired as an author, an abolitionist, as a Civil War Army officer, and clergyman. At that same time, hardly anybody outside of Amherst, Massachusetts had heard of Emily Dickinson. Now, today, partly thanks to Higginson's efforts, Dickinson is one of America's most famous writers, but alas, not that many people recognize Higginson's name. So tonight I am very happy to welcome two friends and colleagues, Catherine Magi and Richard Smith, to balance this lopsided historical ledger of these two remarkable voices of Massachusetts. Um, Richard Smith has lectured on and written about the antebellum United States and 19th century American literature since 1999. He has worked as a public historian in Concord, Massachusetts for 22 years, specializing in Henry David Thoreau, the Transcendentalists, the anti-slavery movement, and the Civil War. And he has written 6 books for Applewood Books. Catherine Magi is an attorney, author, and educator based in the heart of Civil War country. She relishes bringing powerful and often overlooked voices from the past to life. She's the co-author with Dennis Fry of the most comprehensive history of Harpers Ferry National Park ever written, entitled Confluence, Harpers Ferry as Destiny. And her first independently authored history text is anticipated to be released this fall. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So you are welcome to ask a question to be answered at the end of the lecture. Your audio is going to be muted, but use the chat button at the bottom of your screen to open the chat window where you can type your question. So with that, please join me in welcoming Catherine Magi and Richard Smith.
Thank you, Victor. Hello,
Thank
Catherine.
you.
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
Thank you to everyone who is joining us from far and wide. I see a lot of familiar names and friends out there, so thank you so much for joining us. And the reason we are here is because 110 years ago yesterday, Thomas Wentworth Higginson died at his home in Cambridge, Massachusetts at the age of 87. During his long life, he was born on December 22nd, 1823 in Cambridge. And during his long life, he was a Unitarian minister, a Transcendentalist, an abolitionist, a writer, a poet, an editor, a literary critic, and a women's rights activist. In the Civil War, he was the colonel of the 1st All-Black Union Regiment, the 1st South Carolina Volunteer Infantry, and he was severely wounded in the war and left the Army in 1864. He was a friend and lifelong admirer of both Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry Thoreau. He was also a member of the Secret Six, the small group of supporters who gave John Brown the money and weapons for the raid on Harper's Ferry. And he wrote to Brown in 1858, "I am always ready to invest money in treason." In fact, he was the only one of the 6 who did not flee the country or deny his involvement with Brown. And after Brown's execution, Higginson personally raised money for Brown's widow and children. The thing that amazes me about Higginson is he seemed to know anyone and everyone in the literary world and in the reform worlds. And he counted among his closest friends Lucy Stone, John Greenleaf Whittier, James T. Fields, Lydia Mariah Child, Theodore Parker, and Margaret Fuller. And some of his friends and associates included William Lloyd Garrison, Susan B. Anthony, Sophia Peabody Hawthorne, and Charles Darwin. He traveled the world several times. He published over 25 books and wrote some 500 essays, many of which appeared in the Atlantic Monthly. And because of an Atlantic article he wrote in 1862, he was approached by the then unknown 31-year-old Emily Dickinson, who sent him some of her poetry. And she asked Higginson if it was quote unquote alive. And he answered her letter, and the two started a long correspondence that would last until her death. So what we are going to do this evening, in October of 1891, Higginson wrote an article for the Atlantic called The Letters of Emily Dickinson. And this is all both Higginson's words and Emily's words as well, as seen from Higginson's point of view. So we're going to go through this article. I will be reading Higginson's part. And of course, Catherine will be reading Emily's parts. And after we are done with that, we'll wrap up what happened to these two people, and then we'll take questions from the rest of you who are watching. So are you ready, Catherine?
I am ready, Richard. Thank you.
Okay. So from the Atlantic Monthly, October 1891. Few events in American literary history have been more curious than the sudden rise of Emily Dickinson into a posthumous fame, only more accentuated by the utterly recluse character of her life and by her aversion to even a literary publicity. The lines which form a prelude to the published volume of her poems are the only ones that have come to light, indicating even a temporary desire to come in contact with the great world of readers. She seems to have had no reference in all the rest to anything but her own thought and a few friends. But only for her sister, it is very doubtful if her poems would ever have been printed at all. And when published, they were launched quietly and without any expectation of a wide audience. Yet the outcome of it is that 6 editions of the volume have been sold within 6 months, a suddenness of success almost without parallel in American literature. One result of this glare of publicity has been a constant and earnest demand by her readers for further information in regard to her. And I have decided with much reluctance to give some extracts from her early correspondence with one whom she always persisted in regarding, with very little ground for it, as a literary counselor and confidant. It seems to be the opinion of those who have examined her accessible correspondence most widely, that no other letters bring us quite so intimately nearer to the peculiar quality and aroma of her nature. And it has been urged upon me very strongly that her readers have the right to know something more of this gifted and most interesting woman. On April 16, 1862, I took from the post office in Worcester, Massachusetts, where I was then living, the following letter.
Mr. Higginson, are you too deeply occupied to say if my verse is alive? The mind is so near itself it cannot see distinctly, and I have none to ask. Should you think it breathed, and had you leisure to tell me, I should feel quick gratitude. If I make the mistake that you dared to tell me would give sincerer honor toward you, I enclose my name, asking you, sir, if you please, sir, to tell me what is true. That you will not betray me, it is needless to ask, since honor is its own pawn.
The letter was postmarked Amherst, and it was in handwriting so peculiar that it seemed as if the writer might have taken her first lessons by studying the famous fossil bird tracks in the museum of that college town. Yet it was not in the slightest degree illiterate, but cultivated, quaint, and wholly unique. Of punctuation, there was little. She used chiefly dashes, and it has been thought better in printing these letters, as with her poems, to give them the benefit in this respect of the ordinary usages. And so with her habit as to capitalization, as the printers call it, in which she followed the old English and present German method of thus distinguishing every noun. But the most curious thing about the letter was the total absence of a signature. It proved, however, that she had written her name on a card and put it under the shelter of a small envelope enclosed in the larger, and even this name was written, as if the shy writer wished to recede as far as possible from view, in pencil and not in ink. The name was Emily Dickinson. Enclosed with the letter were 4 poems, 2 of which have been already printed, Safe in Their Alabaster Chambers and I'll Tell You How the Sun Rose, together with the 2 that here follow. The first comprises in its 8 lines a truth so searching that it seems a condensed summary of the whole experience of a long life.
We play at paste till qualified for pearl, then drop the paste and deem ourself a fool. The shapes, though, were similar, and our new hands learned gem tactics, practicing sands.
Then came one which I have always classed among the most exquisite of her productions, with a singular felicity of phrase and an aerial lift that bears the ear upward with the bee it traces.
The nearest dream recedes unrealized. The heaven we chase, like the June bee before the schoolboy, invites the race, stoops to an easy clover, dips, evades, teases, deploys, then to the royal clouds, lifts his light pinnace, heedless of the boy, staring bewildered at the mocking sky. Homesick for steadfast honey, the bee flies not which brews that rare variety.
The impression of a wholly new and original poetic genius was as distinct on my mind at that first reading of these 4 poems as it is now, after 30 years of further knowledge. And with it came the problem never yet solved. What place ought to be assigned in literature to what is so remarkable, yet so elusive of criticism? The bee himself did not evade the schoolboy more than she evaded me. And even at this day, I still stand somewhat bewildered, like the boy. Circumstances, however, soon brought me in contact with an uncle of Emily Dickinson, a gentleman not now living, a prominent citizen of Worcester, a man of integrity and character, who shared her abruptness and impulsiveness, but certainly not her poetic temperament, from which he was indeed singularly remote. He could tell but little of her, she being evidently an enigma to him, as to me. It is hard to tell what answer was made by me under these circumstances to this letter. It is probable that the advisor sought to gain time a little and to find out with what strange creature he was dealing. I remember to have ventured on some criticism which she afterwards called surgery, and on some questions, part of which she evaded, as will be seen, with a naive skill such as the most experienced and worldly coquette might envy. Her second letter, received on April 26, 1862, was as follows.
Mr. Higginson, your kindness claimed earlier gratitude, but I was ill and write today from my pillow. Thank you for the surgery. It was not so painful as I supposed. I bring you others as you ask, though they might not differ. While my thought is undressed, I can make the distinction, but when I put them in the gown, they look alike and numb. You asked how old I was. I made no verse but 1 or 2 until this winter, sir. I had a terror since September, I could tell to none, and so I sing as the boy does by the burying ground, because I am afraid. You inquire my books. For poets, I have Keats and Mr. and Mrs. Browning. For prose, Mr. Ruskin, Sir Thomas Browne, and the Revelations. I went to school, but in your manner of the phrase, had no education. When a little girl, I had a friend who taught me immortality, but venturing too near himself, he never returned. Soon after, my tutor died, and for several years, my lexicon was my only companion. Then I found one more, but he was not contented I be his scholar, so he left the land. You ask of my companions. Hills, sir, and the sundown, and a dog as large as myself that my father bought me. They are better than beings because they know but do not tell, and the noise in the pool at noon excels my piano. I have a brother and sister. My mother does not care for thought, and father, too busy with his briefs to notice what we do. He buys me many books, but begs me not to read them, because he fears they joggle the mind. They are religious, except me, and address in eclipse every morning whom they call their father. But I fear my story fatigues you. I would like to learn. Could you tell me how to grow? Or is it unconveyed like melody or witchcraft? You speak of Mr. Whitman. I never read his book, but was told that it was disgraceful. I read Miss Prescott's Circumstance, but it followed me in the dark, so I avoided her. 2 editors of journals came to my father's house this winter and asked me for my mind, and when I asked them why, they said I was penurious, and they would use it for the world. I could not weigh myself. My size felt small to me. I read your chapters in the Atlantic and experienced honor for you. I was sure you would not reject a confiding question. Is this, sir, what you asked me to tell you? Your friend, E. Dickinson.
It will be seen that she had now drawn a step nearer, signing her name and as my friend. It will also be noticed that I had sounded her about certain American authors, then much read, and that she knew how to put her own criticisms in a very trenchant way. With this letter came some more verses, still in the same bird-like script, as for instance, the following.
Your riches taught me poverty, myself a millionaire in little wealths, as girls could boast, till broad as Buenos Aires, you drifted your dominions a different Peru, and I esteemed all poverty for life's estate with you. Of mines, I little know myself, but just the names of gems, the colors of the commonest and scarce of diadems, so much that did I meet the queen, her glory I should know. But this must be a different wealth, to miss it beggars so. I'm sure 'tis India all day to those who look on you without a stint, without a blame. Might I but be the Jew, I'm sure it is Golconda beyond my power to deem, to have a smile for mine each day, how better than a gem. At least it solaces to know that there exists a gold, although I prove it just in time, its distance to behold. It's far, far treasure to surmise and estimate the pearl that slipped my simple fingers through while just a girl at school.
Here was already manifest that defiance of form, never through carelessness, and never precisely from whim, which so marked her. The slightest change in the order of word, thus, while yet at school a girl, would have given her a rhyme for this last line, but no, she was intent upon her thought, and it would not have satisfied her to make the change. The other poem further showed what had already been visible, a rare and delicate sympathy with the life of nature.
A bird came down the walk. He did not know, I saw. He bit an angleworm in halves and ate the fellow raw. And then he drank a dew from a convenient grass, and then hopped sideways to a wall to let a beetle pass. He glanced with rapid eyes that hurried all around. They looked like frightened beads, I thought. He stirred his velvet head, like one in danger, cautious. I offered him a crumb, and he unrolled his feathers and rowed him softer home. Then oars divide the ocean to silver for a seam, where butterflies off banks of noon leap, flashless as they swim.
It is possible that in a second letter, I gave more of a distinct praise or encouragement, for her third is in a different mood. This was received June 8th, 1862. There is something startling in its opening image, and in yet stranger phrase that follows, where she apparently uses mob in the sense of chaos or bewilderment.
Dear friend, your letter gave no drunkenness because I tasted rum before. Domingo comes but once, yet I have had few pleasures so deep as your opinion, and if I tried to thank you, my tears would block my tongue. My dying tutor told me that he would like to live till I had been a poet, but death was much of mob as I could master then. And when, far afterward, a sudden light on orchards or a new fashion in the wind troubled my attention, I felt a palsy here, the verses just relieve. Your second letter surprised me and for a moment swung. I had not supposed it. Your first gave no dishonor because the true are not ashamed. I thanked you for your justice, but could not drip the bells whose jingling cooled my tramp. Perhaps the balm seemed better because you bled me first. I smile when you suggest that I delay to publish, that being foreign to my thought, as firmament to fin. If fame belonged to me, I could not escape her. If she did not, the longest day would pass me on the chase, and the approbation of my dog would forsake me then. My barefoot rank is better. You think my gait spasmodic. I am in danger, sir. You think me uncontrolled. I have no tribunal. Would you have time to be the friend you should think I need? I have a little shape. It would not crowd your desk, nor make much racket as the mouse that dents your galleries. If I might bring you what I do, not so frequent to trouble you, and ask you if I told it clear, it would be to control to me. The sailor cannot see the north, but knows the needle can. The hand you stretch me in the dark, I put mine in and turn away. I have no Saxon now. As if I asked a common alms, and in my wondering hand a stranger pressed a kingdom, and I, bewildered, stand, as if I asked the Orient had it for me a morn, and it should lift its purple dikes and shatter me with dawn. But will you be my preceptor, Mr. Higginson?
With this came the poem already published in her volume and entitled Renunciation, and also that beginning of all the sounds dispatched abroad, thus fixing approximately the date of those two. I must soon have written to ask her for her picture, that I might form some impression of my enigmatical correspondent. To this came the following reply in July 1862.
Could you believe me without? I had no portrait now, but am small like the wren, and my hair is bold like the chestnut burr, and my eyes like the sherry in the glass that the guest leaves. Would this do just as well? It often alarms father. He says death might occur, and he has molds of all the rest, but has no mold of me. But I noticed the quick wore off those things in a few days and forestall the dishonor. You will think no caprice of me. You said dark. I know the butterfly and the lizard and the orchis. Are not those your countrymen? I am happy to be your scholar and will deserve the kindness I cannot repay. If you truly consent, I recite now. Will you tell me my fault frankly as to yourself, for I had rather wince than die. Men do not call the surgeon to commend the bone, but to set it, sir, and fracture within is more critical. And for this, preceptor, I shall bring you obedience, the blossom from my garden, and every gratitude I know. Perhaps you smile at me. I could not stop for that. My business is circumference, in ignorance, not of customs, but if caught with the dawn or the sunset see me, myself the only kangaroo among the beauties, sir, if you please, it afflicts me. And I thought that instruction would take it away. Because you have much business beside the growth of me, you will appoint yourself how often I shall come without your inconvenience. And if at any time you regret you received me, or I prove a different fabric to that you supposed, you must banish me. When I state myself, As the representative of the verse, it does not mean me, but a supposed person. You are true about the perfection. Today makes yesterday mean. You spoke of Pippa passes. I never heard anybody speak of Pippa passes before. You see, my posture is benighted. To thank you baffles me. Are you perfectly powerful? Had I a pleasure you had not, I could delight to bring it. Your scholar.
This was accompanied by this strong poem with its breathless conclusion. The title is of my own giving.
The saints rest. Of tribulation, these are they, denoted by the white. The spangled gowns a lesser rank of victors designate. All these did conquer, but the ones who overcame most times wear nothing commoner than snow, no ornaments but palms. Surrender is a sort unknown on this superior soil, defeat an outgrown anguish, remembered as the mile. Our panting ankle barely passed when night devoured the road, but we stood whispering in the house, and all we said was, saved.
There was a note by the writer of the verses saying that she had spelled ankle wrong. It would seem that at first I tried a very little, to lead her in the direction of rules and traditions. But I fear it was only perfunctory, and that she interested me more in her, so to speak, unregenerate condition. Still, she recognized the endeavor. In this case, as will be seen, I called her attention to the fact that while she took pains to correct the spelling of a word, she was utterly careless of greater irregularities. It will be seen by her answer that with her usual naive adroitness, she turned my point.
Dear friend, are these more orderly? I thank you for the truth. I had no monarch in my life and cannot rule myself. And when I try to organize, my little force explodes and leaves me bare and charred. I think you called me wayward. Will you help me improve? I suppose the pride that stops the breath in the core of woods is not of itself, ourself. You say I confess the little mistake and omit the large, because I can see orthography, but the ignorance out of sight is my preceptor's charge. Of shunning men and women, they talk of hallowed things aloud and embarrass my dog. He and I don't object to them if they'll exist their side. I think Carl would please you. He is dumb and brave. I think you would like the chestnut tree I met in my walk. It hit my notice suddenly, and I thought the skies were in blossom. There's a noiseless noise in the orchard that I let persons hear. You told me in one letter you could not come to see me now, and I made no answer, not because I had none, but did not think myself the price that you should come so far. I do not ask so large a pleasure lest you might deny me. You say, beyond your knowledge. You would not jest with me, because I believe you. But, preceptor, you cannot mean it. All men say, what, to me, but I thought it a fashion. When much in the woods as a little girl, I was told that the snake would bite me, that I might pick a poisonous flower, or goblins kidnap me. But I went along and met no one but angels, who were far shyer of me than I could be of them. So I haven't that confidence in fraud which many exercise. I shall observe your precept, though I don't understand always. I marked a line in one verse because I met it after I made it, and never consciously touched a paint mixed by another person. I did not let go it because it is mine. Have you the portrait of Mrs. Browning? Persons sent me 3. If you had none, will you have mine? Your scholar.
A month or two after this, I entered the volunteer army of the Civil War and must have written to her during the winter of 1862-63 from South Carolina or Florida, for the following reached me in camp.
Amherst. Dear friend, I did not deem that planetary forces annulled, but suffered an exchange of territory or world. I should have liked to see you before you became improbable. War feels to me an oblique place. Should there be other summers, would you perhaps come? I found you were gone by accident, as I find systems are, or seasons of the year, and obtained no cause, but suppose it a treason of progress that dissolves as it goes. Carlo still remained, and I told him, best gains must have the losses test to constitute them gains. My shaggy ally assented. Perhaps death gave me off her friends, striking sharp and early, for I held them since in a brittle love of more alarm than peace. I trust you may pass the limit of war, and though not reared to prayer, when service is had in church for our arms, I include yourself. I was thinking today as I noticed that the supernatural was only the natural disclosed. Not revelation it is that waits, but our unfurnished eyes. But I fear I detain you. Should you, before this reaches you, experience immortality, who will inform me of the exchange? Could you, with honor, avoid death, sir? I entreat you, sir. It would bereave your gnome. I trust the procession of flowers was not a premonition.
As an aside, the procession of flowers was an article that Higginson had just published in the Atlantic. I cannot explain this extraordinary signature substituted for the now customary "your scholar," unless she imagined her friend to be in some incredible and remote condition, imparting its strangeness to her. Mr. Howells reminds me that Swedenborg somewhere has an image akin to her oblique place, where he symbolizes evil as simply an oblique angle. With this letter came verses, most refreshing in that clime of jasmines and mockingbirds on the familiar robin.
The robin. The robin is the one that interrupts the morn with hurried few express reports when March is scarcely on. The robin is the one that overflows the noon with her cherubic quantity in April but begun. The robin is the one that speechless from her nest submits that home and certainty and sanctity are best.
In the summer of 1863, I was wounded and in hospital for a time, during which came this letter in pencil, written from what was practically a hospital for her, though only for weak eyes.
Dear friend, are you in danger? I did not know that you were hurt. Will you tell me more? Mr. Hawthorne died. I was ill since September and since April in Boston for a physician's care. He does not let me go, yet I work in my prison and make guests for myself. Carlo did not come because that he would die in jail, and the mountains I could not hold now, so I brought but the gods. I wish to see you more than before I failed. Will you tell me your health? I am surprised and anxious since receiving your note. The only news I know is bulletins all day from immortality. Can you render my pencil? The physician has taken away my pen. I enclose the address from a letter, lest my figures fail. Knowledge of your recovery would excel my own. E. Dickinson.
Later, this arrived.
Dear friend, I think of you so wholly that I cannot resist to write again to ask if you are safe. Danger is not at first, for then we are unconscious, but in the after, slower days. Do not try to be saved, but let redemption find you, as it certainly will. Love is its own rescue, for we at our supremest are but its trembling emblems. Your scholar.
These were my earliest letters from Emily Dickinson in their order. From this time and up to her death on May 15th, 1886, we corresponded at varying intervals, she always persistently keeping up this attitude of scholar and assuming on my part a preceptorship, which it is almost needless to say did not exist. Always glad to hear her recite, as she called it, I soon abandoned all attempts to guide in the slightest degree this extraordinary nature and simply accepted her confidences, given as much as I could of what might interest her in return. Sometimes there would be a long pause on my part, after which would come a plaintive letter, always terse like this.
Did I displease you? But won't you tell me how?
Or perhaps the announcement of some event, vast to her small sphere, as this.
Amherst. Carlo died. E. Dickinson. Would you instruct me now?
Or sometimes there would arrive an exquisite little detached strain, every word a picture, like this.
The hummingbird. A route of evanescence with a revolving wheel, a resonance of emerald, a rush of cochineal, and every blossom on her bush adjusts its tumbled head. The mail from Tunis, probably, an easy morning's ride.
Nothing in literature, I am sure, so condenses into a few words that gorgeous atom of life and fire of which she here attempts the description. It is, however, needless to conceal that many of her brilliant fragments were less satisfying. She almost always grasped whatever she sought, but with some fracture of grammar and dictionary on the way. Often, too, she was obscure and sometimes inscrutable, and though obscurity is sometimes, in Coleridge's phrase, a compliment to the reader, yet it is never safe to press this compliment too hard. Sometimes, on the other hand, her verses found too much favor for her comfort, and she was urged to publish. In such cases, I was sometimes put forward as a defense, and the following letter was the fruit of some such occasion.
Dear friend, thank you for the advice. I shall implicitly follow it. The one who asked me for the lines I had never seen. He spoke of a charity. I refused, but did not inquire. He again earnestly urged on the ground that in that way I might aid unfortunate children. The name of child was a snare to me, and I hesitated, choosing my most rudimentary and without criterion. I inquired of you. You can scarcely estimate the opinion to one utterly guideless. Again, thank you, your scholar.
Again came this on a similar theme.
Dear friend, are you willing to tell me what is right? Mrs. Jackson of Colorado, H.H., her early schoolmate, was with me a few minutes this week and wished me to write for this. A circular of the no-name series was enclosed. I told her I was unwilling, and she asked me why. I said I was incapable, and she seemed not to believe me and asked me not to decide for a few days. Meantime, she would write me. She was so sweetly noble. I would regret to estrange her. And if you would be willing to give me a note saying you disapproved it and thought me unfit, she would believe you. I am sorry to flee so often to my safest friend, but hope he permits me.
In all this time, nearly 8 years, we had never met, but she had sent invitations like the following.
Amherst, dear friend, whom my dog understood, could not elude others. I should be so glad to see you, but I think it an apparitional pleasure not to be fulfilled. I am uncertain of Boston. I have promised to visit my physician for a few days in May, but father objects because he is in the habit of me. Is it more far to Amherst? You'll find a minute host, but a spacious welcome. If I still entreat you to teach me, are you much displeased? I will be patient, constant, never reject your knife. And should my slowness goad you, you knew before myself that except the smaller size, no lives are round. These hurry to a sphere and show and end. The larger, slower grow and later hang. The summers of the Hesperides are long.
Afterwards came this.
Amherst, dear friend, a letter always feels to me like immortality, because it is the mind alone without a corporeal friend. Indebted in our talk to attitude and accent, there seems a spectral power in thought that walks alone. I would like to thank you for your great kindness, but never try to lift the words which I cannot hold. Should you come to Amherst, I might then succeed, though gratitude is the timid wealth of those who have nothing. I am sure that you speak the truth because the noble do, but your letters always surprise me. My life has been too simple and stern to embarrass any. Scene of angels, scarcely my responsibility. It is difficult not to be fictitious in so fair a place, but tests severe repairs are permitted all. When a little girl, I remember hearing that remarkable passage and preferring the power, not knowing at the time that kingdom and glory were included. You noticed my dwelling alone. To an emigrant, country is idle, except it be his own. You speak kindly of seeing me. Could it please your convenience to come so far as Amherst, I should be very glad, but I do not cross my father's ground to any house or town. Of our greatest acts, we are ignorant. You are not aware that you saved my life. To thank you in person has been since then one of my few requests. You will excuse each that I say, because no one taught me.
At last, after many postponements on August 16th, 1870, I found myself face to face with my hitherto unseen correspondent. It was at her father's house, one of those large square brick mansions so familiar in our older New England towns, surrounded by trees and blossoming shrubs without, and within exquisitely neat, cool, spacious, and fragrant with flowers. After a little delay, I heard an extremely faint and pattering footstep like that of a child in the hall, and in glided almost noiselessly a plain, shy little person, the face without a single good feature, but with eyes, as she herself said, like the
Like the
sherry
cherry.
the guest leaves in the glass, and with smooth bands of reddish chestnut hair. She had a quaint and nun-like look, as if she might be a German canoness of some religious order, whose prescribed garb was peak white with a blue net worsted shawl. She came toward me with 2 daylilies, which she put in a childlike way into my hand, saying softly under her breath,
These are my introduction.
and also adding under her breath in childlike fashion,
Forgive me if I am frightened. I never see strangers and hardly know what I say.
but soon she began to talk, and thenceforward continued almost constantly, pausing sometimes to beg that I would talk instead, but readily recommencing when I evaded. There was not a trace of affectation in all this. She seemed to speak absolutely for her own relief, and wholly without watching its effect on her hearer. Led on by me, she told much about her early life, in which her father was always the chief figure, evidently a man of the old type, la vieille roche of Puritanism, a man who, as she said, read on Sunday, quote, lonely and rigorous books, and who had from childhood inspired her with such awe that she never learned to tell time by the clock till she was 15, simply because he had tried to explain it to her when she was a little child, and she had been afraid to tell him that she did not understand, and also afraid to ask anyone else lest he should hear of it. Yet she never heard him speak a harsh word, and it needed only a glance at his photograph to see how truly the Puritan tradition was preserved in him. He did not wish his children when little to read anything but the Bible, and when one day her brother brought her home Longfellow's Kavanaugh, He put it secretly under the pianoforte cover, made signs to her, and they both afterwards read it. It may have been before this, however, that a student of her father's was amazed to find that she and her brother had never heard of Lydia Maria Child, then much read, and he brought her Letters from New York and hid it in the great bush of old-fashioned tree box beside the front door. After the first book, she thought in ecstasy,
This then is a book, and there are more of them.
but she did not find so many as she expected, for she afterwards said to me,
When I lost the use of my eyes, it was a comfort to think that there were so few real books that I could easily find one to read me all of them.
afterwards, when she regained her eyes, she read Shakespeare and thought to herself,
Why is any other book needed?
she went on talking constantly and saying in the midst of narrative things quaint and aphoristic, such as,
Is it oblivion or absorption when things pass from our minds? Truth is such a rare thing. It is delightful to tell it. I find ecstasy in living. The mere sense of living is joy enough.
when I asked her if she ever felt any want of employment, not going off the grounds and rarely seeing a visitor, she answered,
I never thought of conceiving that I could ever have the slightest approach to such a want in all future time.
and then added after a pause,
I feel that I have not expressed myself strongly enough.
although it seemed to me that she had. She told me of her household occupations, that she made all her bread because her father liked only hers, and saying shyly,
And people must have their puddings.
this very timidly and suggestively, as if they were meteors or comets. Interspersed with these confidences came phrases so emphasized as to seem the very wantonness of overstatement, as if she pleased herself with putting into words what the most extravagant might possibly think without saying, as this.
How do most people live without any thought? There are many people in the world. You must have noticed them in the street. How do they live? How do they get strength to put their clothes on in the morning?
Or this crowning extravaganza.
If I read a book and it makes my whole body so cold no fire can ever warm me, I know that is poetry. If I feel physically as if the top of my head were taken off, I know that is poetry. These are the only ways I know it. Is there any other way?
I have tried to describe her just as she was, with the aid of notes taken at the time. But this interview left our relation very much what it was before. On my side, an interest that was strong and even affectionate, but not based on any thorough comprehension. And on her side, a hope, always a rather baffled, that I should afford some aid in solving her abstruse problems of life. The impression undoubtedly made on me was that of an excess of tension and of an abnormal life. Perhaps in time I could have got beyond that somewhat overstrained relation, which not my will, but her needs had forced upon us. Certainly, I should have been most glad to bring it down to the level of simple truth and everyday comradeship, but it was not altogether easy. She was much too enigmatical a being for me to solve in an hour's interview, and an instinct told me that the slightest attempt at direct cross-examination would make her withdraw into her shell. I could only sit still and watch, as one does in the woods. I must name my bird without a gun, as recommended by Emerson. Under this necessity, I had not opportunity to see that human and humorous side of her, which is strongly emphasized by her nearer friends, and which shows itself in her quaint and unique description of a rural burglary contained in the volume of her poems. Hence, even her letters to me show her mainly on her exaltee side, and should a volume of her correspondence ever be printed, it is very desirable that it should contain some of her letters to friends of closer and more familiar intimacy. After my visit came this letter.
Enough is so vast a sweetness, I suppose it never occurs, only pathetic counterfeits. Fabulous to me as the men of the revelations who shall not hunger anymore. Even the possible has its insoluble particle. After you went, I took Macbeth and turned to Birnam Wood, came twice to Dunsinane. I thought and went about my work. The vein cannot thank the artery, but her solemn indebtedness to him. Even the stolidest admit, and so of me who try, whose effort leaves no sound. You ask great questions accidentally. To answer them would be events. I trust that you are safe. I ask you to forgive me for all the ignorance I had. I find no nomination so sweet as your low opinion. Speak, if but to blame your obedient child. You told me of Mrs. Lowell's poems. Would you tell me where I could find them, or are they not for sight? An article of yours, too, perhaps the only one you wrote that I never knew. It was about a latch. Are you willing to tell me? Perhaps a sketch. If I ask too much, you could please refuse. Shortness to live has made me bold. Abroad is close tonight, and I have but to lift my hands to touch the heights of Abraham. Dickinson.
When I said at parting that I would come again sometime, she replied,
Say in a long time, that will be nearer. Sometime is no time.
We met only once again, and I have no express record of that visit. We corresponded for years at long intervals, her side of the intercourse being, I fear, better sustained. And she sometimes wrote also to my wife, enclosing flowers or fragrant leaves with a verse or two. Once she sent her one of George Eliot's books, I think Middlemarch, and wrote,
I am bringing you a little granite book for you to lean upon.
At other times, she would send a single poem such as these, The Blue Jay.
No brigadier throughout the year so civic as the jay, a neighbor and a warrior too, with shrill felicity, pursuing winds that censure us a February day. The brother of the universe was never blown away. The snow and he are intimate. I've often seen them play when heaven looked upon us all with such severity. I felt apology were due to an insulted sky, whose pompous frown was nutriment to their temerity. The pillow of this daring head is pungent evergreens. His larder, terse and militant, unknown, refreshing things. His character, a tonic. His future, a dispute. Unfair in immortality that leaves this neighbor out. The white heat. Dare you see a soul at the white heat? Then crouch within the door. Red is the fire's common tint. But when the vivid ore has sated flame's conditions, its quivering substance plays without a color, but the light of unanointed blaze. Least village boasts its blacksmith, whose anvil's even din stands symbol for the finer forge that soundless tugs within. Refining these impatient ores with hammer and with blaze, until the designated light repudiated the forge.
Then came the death of her father, that strong Puritan father who had communicated to her so much of the vigor of his own nature, and who bought her many books, but begged her not to read them. Mr. Edward Dickinson, after service in the National House of Representatives and other public positions, had become a member of the lower house of the Massachusetts legislature. The session was unusually prolonged, and he was making a speech upon some railway question at noon one very hot day on July 16th, 1874, when he became suddenly faint and sat down. The house adjourned, and a friend walked him to his lodgings at the Tremont House, where he began to pack his bag for home after sending for a physician, but he died within 3 hours. Soon afterwards, I received the following letter.
That last afternoon that my father lived, though with no premonition, I preferred to be with him and invented an absence for mother Vinnie, her sister, being asleep. He seemed peculiarly pleased, as I often just stayed with myself, and remarked as the afternoon withdrew, he would like it not to end. His pleasure almost embarrassed me, and my brother coming, I suggested they walk. Next morning, I woke him for the train and saw him no more. His heart was pure and terrible, and I think no other like it exists. I am glad there is immortality, but would have tested it myself before entrusting him. Mr. Bowles was with us. With that exception, I saw none. I have wished for you since my father died, and had you an hour unengrossed, it would be almost priceless. Thank you for your kindness.
Later, she wrote,
when I think of my father's lonely life and lonelier death, there is this redress. Take all away. The only thing worth larceny is left, the immortality. My earliest friend wrote me the week before he died. If I live, I will go to Amherst. If I die, I certainly will. Is your house deeper off? Your scholar.
A year afterward came this.
Dear friend, mother was paralyzed Tuesday. A year from the evening father died. I thought perhaps you would care. Your scholar.
With this came the following verse, having a curious 17th century flavor.
A death blow is a life blow to some, who till they died did not alive become, who had they lived had died, but when they died, vitality begun.
And later came this kindred memorial of one of the oldest and most faithful friends of the family, Mr. Samuel Bowles of the Springfield Republican newspaper.
Dear friend, I find it shelter to speak to you. My brother and sister are with Mr. Bowles, who is buried this afternoon. The last song that I heard that was since the birds was, he leadeth me, yea, though I walk. Then the voices stooped. The arch was so low.
After this added bereavement, the inward life of the diminished Dickinson household became only more concentrated, and the world was held farther and farther away. Yet to this period belongs the following letter, written about 1880, which has more of what is commonly called the objective or external quality than any she ever wrote me, and shows how close might have been her observation and her sympathy had her rare qualities taken a somewhat different channel.
Dear friend, I was touchingly reminded of a child who had died this morning by an Indian woman with gay baskets and a dazzling baby at the kitchen door. Her little boy once died, she said, death to her dispelling him. I asked her what the baby liked, and she said, to step. The prairie before the door was gay with flowers of hay, and I let her in. She argued with the birds. She leaned on clover walls, and they fell and dropped her. With jargon sweater than a bell, she grappled buttercups, and they sank together, the buttercups the heaviest. What sweetest use of days. 'Twas noting some such scene made Vaughan humbly say, my days that are at best but dim and hoary. I think it was Vaughan.
And these few fragmentary memorials, closing like every human biography with funerals, yet with such as were to Emily Dickinson only the stately introduction to a higher life, and may well end with her description of the death of the summer she so loved. And that's it for the Higginson part of this, his writings. We'll just wrap up quickly with saying that after the Civil War, Higginson continued his life of reform. He was very much involved with the women's rights movement. And in fact, he helped found the American Women's Suffrage Association in 1877. He was the editor of their magazine for 14 years. He advocated for women's suffrage and also for equal access to education and for equal pay for equal work, especially in teaching roles. In 1905, he joined with Jack London and Upton Sinclair to form the Intercollegiate Socialist Society. And the society sponsored lecture tours, magazines, seminars, and discussion circles all over the United States to propagate socialist ideas among America's college population. He continued to travel the world and write. And finally, he passed away on May 9th, 1911, at the age of 87. And as for Emily, she passed and she really saw nothing printed in her lifetime, did she, Catherine?
She did not. She saw about roughly 10 poems, I think, were published during her lifetime, and which, feels like a success for many of us who dream of being published authors. But consider that she wrote over 1,800.
Right.
That's how massive her collection was, and what a prolific writer. And most of these were not discovered until after she had passed and collected
Right.
by her sister.
And it was because of her sister, Vinnie, that really the poems came to light. And to make a long story short, Mabel Loomis Todd and Higginson got together and made sure that those poems got published around 1890 or so. A lot of people complained that they did kind of change things around some of the poetry. Higginson was guilty of using real punctuation instead of the dashes that Emily used. But he and Mabel Todd actually complained a lot about how they should be printed, which ones should be printed, which ones should be published. But because of them, Emily came to be known to the world at large around 1890 or so. So that is our program. We would love to open it up to questions.
You're starting to answer some of the questions that have been asked in the thread, and I would invite either of you to speak to these questions. One is that, of course, Emily's poems were heavily edited by others when published after her death. And did Higginson make comments on those edits?
He kind of thought the edits would make the poetry more palatable. Higginson was, when it came to poetry, he didn't like anything really too radical, which is why I think Emily's poetry kind of confused him at times. He absolutely did not like and did not understand Walt Whitman and Leaves of Grass. Higginson was more of a Longfellow, Whittier guy. He liked that sort of kind of classical poetry. So he did do some editing, thinking that more people would like it. But he really thought that he was doing a service to the poetry reading public by adding the proper punctuation and doing editing and stuff like that. So because of his Boston Brahmin background, he thought he was doing the right thing.
Okay, thank you. Question about where Dickinson's poetry was originally published.
You mean when she was alive?
The exact question is, sorry if you mentioned this, but where was this originally published?
Some of her stuff was published in the newspaper, the Springfield Republican. That's where, and it was all published anonymously.
Is the question about what we read tonight, that the article that Higginson wrote, because that's from.
If you're still there, Tammy, can you clarify?
Yes, what was read.
That was from the Atlantic Monthly from October of 1891. And if you Google the letters of Emily Dickinson by Higginson, it'll come up. The Atlantic has a really great website where they publish a lot of the 19th century essays. And you can find almost all of Higginson's Atlantic essays online, including that one that we just read.
Thank you. Here's a question. What was the Coleridge obscurity quotation that Higginson gave?
Oh, I tried to find it. I mean, obviously Coleridge was one of Higginson's favorite poets. And I tried looking up and finding exactly what he meant by that, but I couldn't find anything. So I'm sorry. I don't have an answer for an obscure Coleridge poem that probably hasn't been read by anybody in 100 years. So if I could find the answer, I'll try to let people know.
Was worth a try though. Here's a question, not about the literature, but just about Higginson himself, about his family life, about his life as a husband and father, and asking about his children. What became of them?
So his first wife was Mary Channing Higginson. She was the sister of Ellery Channing, who people in Concord know very well. And they never had any children. Mary was very unhealthy for most of her life. A lot of historians think she might have been suffering from multiple sclerosis. And she actually ended up being housebound and wheelchair bound for quite a while. She died in 1877. He married another Mary Thatcher, in 1879, and they had one daughter. And Margaret Higginson was born in 1884.
Thank you. Well, those are the questions. So I thank you very much for. There is one more question. How did Dickinson first come to write to Higginson?
Oh, so Higginson wrote an essay for The Atlantic called Letters to a Young Contributor in 1862. And basically, it was a how-to for young writers. Here's how you should get published. And he gave advice. He said things like, you should use fresh ink and clean white paper. You should write with a legible hand. It was basically, how do I get my stuff published? And we know that the Dickinson household read The Atlantic. And so Emily read that Letters to a Young Contributor. And so out of the blue, she just wrote a letter to Higginson saying, here's my poetry. What do you think? And Higginson complained to James Fields, the editor, that he was just getting all this really horrible poetry. And he just said that, these are things that I will not be sending to you. But then Emily wrote to him, and needless to say, it changed his life and it changed her life. And at first he kind of put up with her. I think that he thought she was quaint and weird and interesting. His wife actually read the letters. He shared the letters with his wife, and she said, "Why do the insane always cling to you?" And so Emily, of course, seems to have won her over with books and flowers and stuff. But, this was really one of the great literary relationships. I mean, if it wasn't for Higginson, we probably never would have known anything about Emily's poetry. So it was just sheer luck that he wrote this article and she wrote him a letter saying, hey, what do you think of this? I still don't think he completely understood exactly the poetry that she was sending him. I think that it was so far out of his realm. He thought it was beautiful and weird and unique, but I don't think he quite got how earth-shaking and world-changing her poetry really was.
We got one more question, and then this will be the last one. Did Emily Dickinson leave instructions for Bronte's poem to be read at her funeral? And if so, what's the source for that?
She did, and that's why Higginson read it. Emily had her funeral completely planned out, what she would wear, the color of the coffin, where she should be buried. She actually had the house, the staff of the house, the cooks and the maids and the others, she had them carry her coffin to the cemetery. She had it all laid out for them to follow.
Well, thank you, Richard. Well, Richard and Catherine, thank you both so much. This has been a terrific presentation, and I also want to thank all of our listeners for joining us this evening. And I really hope that you will come back and join us for our next event. The Transcendentalism Council is going to present Robert Gross. So I will be interviewing historian Robert Gross on June the 6th. He will be talking about his new book, The Transcendentalists and Their World. We're very excited about that, and I will be sending out details and registration link this week. So I hope that you will join us for that.
And I would like to thank first Victor and the Transcendentalism Council and First Parish. Thank you so much. Catherine, thank you so much. This was fabulous. I really had a great time. And thank you to everybody who joined in and watched us this evening. Thanks to all my friends and our friends and everybody that joined us. This was really a lot of fun.
And it is recorded, so I will be posting a link, sending a link to all of everyone who registered to watch the video.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good night.